Maybe I'll do the whole thing in Spanish.
That would be cool.
How many
I can
Spanish
help with
speakers?
that.
French. You need to do French. I don't speak Spanish. I'm from
Juanita
Canada.
speaks French too.
There you go.
German?
No German, sorry. My Spanish is not very good, so Michelle and Carlos would just make fun of me.
I'll
But I
never
get
do that.
practice. I get practice soon.
Oh, I see people starting to join now. Oh, everyone's so quiet.
Are we broadcasting yet?
Thanks, Chris, for that. Yes, and we're recording as well. Thanks for joining today, everyone. We'll begin shortly. Just give everyone a couple more minutes to join in. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to TPGI's second day of webinars, excuse me, in celebration of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. I'm Stephanie Kushner, and I do business development here at TPGI. We'll wait one more minute or so. People are still joining, it looks like. And then we'll get started with a few housekeeping items and our panel discussion. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our panel discussion on the business of accessibility with Mark Miller as the moderator. A few housekeeping items I want to mention before we get started. This session is being recorded and we will email everyone the recording after the event. We do have captions available, so feel free to use them as needed. We will have some time, hopefully at the end of the session, for live Q&A. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your panel, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. Sometimes we miss the questions if you put them in the chat, so please try to use the Q&A box if you can. Lastly, I'd like to mention if anyone needs any accessibility support, of course, let us know. I will have my email address, or you can reach TPGI at the info@tpgi.com. And with that, I'll let Mark Miller get started and introduce our lovely panel.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank all of you for attending Business of Accessibility, and welcome to our expert panel. The first thing I want to do is just introduce you to all these wonderful people that are going to be talking to us today. So with that, I'd like to, and please give a wave when I say your name, just I think everybody can see it, but just so they know who it is. I want to start with Dina Wainwright. Hi, Dina. Dina is the Vice President of Digital Accessibility, practice owner, personnel investing at Fidelity. Dina has spent nearly 30 years in the field of digital accessibility. She has worked for well-known universities, nonprofits, tech companies, and financial service institutions. At these organizations, Dina has filled roles such as assistive technology researcher, technical writer, public relations associate, and accessibility evaluator. She has delivered accessibility workshops in North America, Europe, Asia. In 2006, Dina received a master's in, a master's in rehabilitation psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And most recently, Dina's career has shifted to building and managing digital accessibility programs in large enterprises. She is happiest when she is learning, strategizing, and creating new things. And Dina, while I was reading that, you were getting bows from other panel members. So very impressive. One of those people was Christopher Patno. Welcome, Christopher. Christopher is head of accessibility and digital inclusion for EMEA at Google. Christopher is the head of accessibility and disability. He leads Google's efforts around the accessibility of product, people, policy, and partnerships across EMEA, with particular focus on emerging markets. He has more than 25 years experience in tech, working at companies like Apple, Sony Ericsson, Disney, where he's built hardware, software, games, and services. His current passion is accessibility at the intersection of immersive technology, XR, and customer hardware. He is the chair for the Immersive Captions Community Group with the W3C, the Accessibility Working Group co-chair for the AR Association, sits on the board of trustees for the American Foundation for the Blind and the GAD Foundation. Christopher has a degree in music from UC Berkeley. Does it mean we're going to get a little singing today, Christopher?
You didn't get me the drinks early enough, so maybe next time.
No, gotcha. Sorry about that. Next time. The next, I'd like to introduce Juanita George. Hi, Juanita. She is the DA Digital Program Manager at Navy Federal Credit Union. She joined Navy Federal in 2020 and currently works as an ADA Program Manager leading enterprise accessibility efforts, as well as chairing the Accessibility Allies Community of Practice, which she invited me to speak at once. It was a very good organization. She represents NFCU on the Accessibility Guides and ARIA workshop groups at the W3C, using her years of learning and development expertise. She also recently joined the Internet Society's accessibility community. Outside of work, she is active in the community, serving as an election worker and as a tutor for adults learning how to read. Juanita is also an attorney and provides pro bono legal services as a volunteer at the Pro Bono Resource Center in Maryland. When she's not working or serving the community, she enjoys traveling, photography, and hiking with her husband. And then Michelle Lena, welcome.
Hi.
Hi, Michelle is a visual designer, 4 at Navy Federal Credit Union. Michelle joined Navy Federal in May of 2017 and is a senior visual designer for the UX design team. Her primary focus is supporting omni-channel deliverables. Currently, she is a member of the NFCU ADA Task Force with the goal of adapting more inclusive design strategy around ADA initiatives and project processes. Michelle has more than 20 years of experience providing digital deliverables and creating design experiences that bring together multiple products and scenarios for mobile and web products. Over the years, Michelle has worked closely with a variety of clients, from mid startup firms to Fortune 500 organization. Michelle holds a bachelor's degree in studio arts animation at George Mason University. Originally from Manila, Philippines, Michelle lives in Herndon, Virginia, with her dog, Bailey. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Carlos, how are you? Last but certainly not least, welcome.
Hello, everybody.
Carlos is the accessibility industry specialist, people accessibility and disability experience, ADEX at Amazon. Carlos is an accessibility industry specialist with Amazon with 7+ years of experience leading different organizations and providing accessibility experiences to their customers and employees. Carlos emphasizes in the technical aspects of accessibility and enjoys empowering tech teams to write accessible code when not working. Carlos can be found playing and coaching soccer around the Twin Cities metro area. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have this panel. What an amazing group of people with an unbelievable amount of experience in accessibility, and certainly in what we're talking about today, which is the business of accessibility. I want to start off just talking about the current state of accessibility and what you are seeing in the businesses in terms of kind of where we are today. There's a few things that have sort of come up recently that I think are influencing accessibility. And one of them is the EUAA, which has put a deadline that anybody sort of doing business in European areas needs to be accessible with their digital presence in 2025. So that's the EN 301-549 for those of you who don't know it. We also know that we've got increasing litigation, right? That seems to be a theme every year for us. In 2022, we saw a 12% increase in litigation. And then this year, the WHO's reported that 1.3 billion people experience significant disability, which is 1 in 6 of us, if you do that math out. So from the standpoint of your business and what you guys are seeing from kind of your roles, where do you see the current state of accessibility? What are the things that you think are creeping up as sort of the priority concerns that are affecting the decisions that you all make? I'll call
Christopher.
Hey, Christopher.
This is Christopher. I can go first. I mean, the EAA, the European Accessibility Act, is more than just EN 31549. It's much more than that. They actually have a number of features that have to be implemented depending upon the context of whether it's e-banking, e-books, smartphone, ATM machines. So it's actually quite a bit more than just compliance. It's actually a usability context that is being sort of passed throughout all the European spaces. So that is certainly having an impact in terms of the work that organizations like we have at Google. In fact, the EAA was one of the tent poles that brought me to London, is to try to come up here and build up the understanding and build up the relationships that allows us to go and make our products better and compliant and useful across Europe.
So you've seen a huge impact, and I'm sure the deadline is that largely what's pushing and driving a lot of the urgency around it for you?
Well, I moved here in 2021, so I moved here with 4 years to go, and only in the more recent times am I seeing organizations outside really start to pay attention. So we've been looking towards it and working towards it for quite some time.
Oh, excellent.
Always more work that can be done. But now that we're like T-minus 24 months, 25 months, now we're starting to see a lot more noise, a lot of anxiety from organizations outside throughout the region really start to pay attention and start making noise. So that's a huge source of the compliance kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
For me, where I'm really excited about where things are going is like the new AI stuff, the generative AI, how that can impact. I was really impressed with the prototype that Be My Eyes did with GPT-4. Some really cool stuff, and it's really neat to see competition happening in terms of AI and accessibility.
And just really quick, can you, I'm familiar with Be My Eyes, but in case people aren't, can you give a quick overview of what they are?
Be My Eyes is a company that creates a tool that allows someone to use a smartphone that connects to a human to provide visual descriptions of the things around them. What they've done is they've added sort of a GPT, I think it's actually GPT-4, if I remember correctly, where they're using that as a visual input into the LLM, and the LLM is providing its best ability to describe the things that are there. It's not perfect. But it is really interesting, and I think a great starting place.
Yeah, I think generative AI obviously is a hot topic this year for everyone in every field. But does anybody have any sort of thoughts in terms of how that might affect accessibility in general and the businesses?
I think, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I heard you starting, so I was just going to tell you to go ahead.
Oh, no worries. I think it's going to create it's going to open the floodgates and make accessibility a lot more accessible to organizations and really help them scale their accessibility practices. Just from things for like writing more accessible content, for instance, for folks with cognitive disabilities, or creating new features that reach more people. I mean, I am a tech optimist, so I really see, a lot of value coming from AI and other, innovations that's really going to help the space, I think.
Excellent. So so we certainly can keep talking about generative AI, but what other challenges and do you see kind of coming up this year? Ian's a big one. I think everybody's thinking about AI. Are there anything else that you guys are seeing or that are particular focuses for you this year in business?
I think the problem of scale. So there are a lot of different models of accessibility in large organizations, and there's everyone's trying to figure out how to do it just the right way so that you're building with accessibility in mind. So really trying to implement shift left strategies, I think, is going to be a focus for a lot of businesses that want to get out of the remediation audit cycle that a lot of organizations are sort of stuck in, where they're remediating things and then fixing them, going through huge projects to fix them and then remediating them as they're releasing new features, and trying to catch those all up front and trying to design and bake accessibility in, I think, is going to be a big challenge as folks move to sort of the next stage in their accessible development practices.
Yeah, I agree with you. We see a lot of that from our standpoint, where organizations that have been doing it in a project basis over the past few years are really looking at that and really thinking about essentially the return on investment for shifting that left and baking it into the software development lifecycle, and other aspects of the organization, right? Maturity starts to look at all sorts of different process areas. So I think that that's a big one. And I know that that's probably table stakes for the panel here, but I think a lot of other, businesses are starting to think about that. Carlos, you unmuted. Did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think one aspect that is still relevant since I started doing work in accessibility is around education and academia, right? Once all these players hit the workforce and we start introduce them to accessibility and how all their micro decisions that they make in their daily jobs, whether it's design, writing content, writing code, has a huge potential impact and for the outcome of an accessibility, right? So we'll still see that challenge in the professional workforce, right? That there isn't enough education for young professionals joining, whether it's a large or small or medium size corporation. We still have that huge gap. So it becomes another challenge in companies to be able to bring these professionals up to speed into knowledge and practicing and accessibility, implementing best practices at a pace that not only disrupts the business in terms of prioritization and deliverables, but also in a way that these professionals feel included as to what are the organization aiming to do for accessibility, what quality means, how do we want to implement things in order to be able to, as Juanita was saying, shift left, move to a shift left strategy that overall it brings great benefits for people with disabilities, and also brings a way more cohesive and effective approach as to how to do accessibility.
I think that's a really good point about education, and that it's not, you know, development work and things like that certainly are taught in school, but accessibility is not always brought into it. And Christopher actually put IAP and tech access as ways to get education, but I think the point being that lots of times it's on the job that people are learning. Dina, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I had two things actually. So I would say the other challenge is, right, the fact that as people are moving more and more toward digital, which I think was accelerated a lot by the pandemic, as you're taking other channels away, like phones or, you know, printed or braille media, the need for what's left, which is digital, to be fully accessible is high. And I think that, you know, in the comments about scalability, companies are struggling with how fast they can deliver those digital channels in a fully accessible way, because at the same time that they're trying to deliver them, they're also, you know, having their strategic priority is to move away from other platforms other than digital as fast as possible, right? So it's like two competing things racing toward a goal of digital as opposed to other things. So I would say that's something. And I think to feed off the education comment, which I totally agree with, I think the other challenge is still that there's a lack of women leaders in the space, right? It's kind of exciting to see this many women on this panel, but I think that's still a gap where we still are underrepresented in the most like senior parts of an organization.
So Dina, if I can, just going off of that last comment, I know that you were part of a group at CSUN.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know CSUN, it's the kind of the largest conference on accessibility and assistive technology that happens throughout the year. And this year it was in Anaheim. But you and Juanita, you were also on this group as well, had created a group at CSUN around that. Can you just talk about that a little bit more, the problem and that group?
Well, I think so. So what I was fortunate to do, I had a session with a really close friend and former colleague of mine named Kathy Martinez, and many of you probably know her. She's been in the field a really long time, and she's had a pretty amazing career doing things like working for President Obama and leading World Institute on Disability. And you know, we talked about sort of how the industry has changed, but we also talked about the fact that, you know, the people of disability, with disabilities of working age, that only 16% of us are working. And of that 16%, there are 3 men with disabilities employed to every 2 women. And that women with disabilities have the lowest rates of educational attainment and salary, right, income. And even when we are employed, a quarter of us still live in poverty. And, you know, as you get to those women, you get a fraction of them. It's something like 3% of the women with disabilities that are employed are women of color, right? So it's just this compounded problem where the statistics they're just overwhelmingly not in our favor. And so that's where that observation around the gap comes from.
And I wanted to sort of piggyback off that to another challenge that organizations are facing, organizations that want to give more folks a seat at the table, which is going and making internal communications applications accessible, which is pivotal to giving more folks access to those kinds of roles and encouraging diversity and having a diverse pipeline of talent at your organization. And so I think that there's a lot of solutioning that's going on out there to try to rectify that as well.
Yeah, and I would agree, because it's basically right that because a lot of the internal systems aren't accessible, there aren't enough of us there to motivate change, right? We don't get critical mass to bring attention to that. And because we're not there to motivate the change doesn't happen. So it's like this cyclical thing. And, it's interesting talking about the associate or employee facing aspect of this, because I was reading in conjunction with some internal work that we were doing at Fidelity, some studies that were done by Harvard Business Review. And their estimate is that only about a third of us with disabilities in the workforce actually disclose that we have them in the first place. And I think that that's a whole other conversation, but I think it also contributes to the challenges that we have with internal systems not being accessible and not having enough voices to say, hey, like, this is a problem. This system not being accessible is impacting my ability to fully do my job to its maximum potential.
I'd like to add another challenge also is, as a visual designer, I've learned that, having good guidelines and documentation can help bring accessibility awareness, earlier on in the project. A lot of accessibility issues can be prevented in the design phase. Documenting is a nice mental effort, let's say, as to force us to take a step back and then, ask ourselves, how will someone interact with this component with a mouse, with a keyboard? What will the screen reader announce for that? That way, accessibility becomes a part of the project normal design and development phases, and it's not an afterthought anymore.
This is Christopher. I'm
Nope,
sorry.
go ahead.
Just leading into the education part, there's this really cool thing called Blue Lines that I've heard many companies starting to use. If you haven't looked at it, this is a great way to think about accessibility in the design context. There's red lines for visual designers where it's like pixel perfect where everything is supposed to live. But blue lines is a description of how things are supposed to work from an accessibility perspective. Many companies have things similar to this, but blue lines is something that is external to a company that people can adopt, and I would recommend taking a look at.
Great advice. Great advice. Yeah, I think that, when we just circling all the way back around to shift left, which we started talking about, obviously, Michelle, the design phase is that's the planning phase. When we always use an analogy of an architect, it's much easier for them to erase their designs than for a foreman to try and retrofit something into an existing building. So it really is about starting there. Dina,
I just wanted to ask Christopher really quickly, is there a particular site or set of resources you would refer people to, or is it just like go and Google, no pun intended?
Blue Lines.
Yeah, Google Blue Lines. Yeah, okay.
I will Google it for you and put a link in the chat.
Nice.
Perfect. Thank you. Can you send that out later, Mark, like the link?
Yeah, we'll gather
Perfect.
that up and I'll have it.
Awesome. Sorry, you were going to ask something now.
Oh, I just was, one of the things that you touched on, Dina, was this, you were saying only, I think 1/3 of people disclose, if I wrote that down quickly. And it seems like so disclosure is a difficult topic because you don't want to and can't ask people or force people for sure to disclose because it's really private information. But what kind of challenges does that provide for a business? Because I would imagine that if you're only aware of 1/3 of the people with disabilities or the disabilities or the needs for accommodation, or however you want to kind of say that out, that you have to accommodate for within a business, that it becomes actually difficult to accommodate. What is that something that you see? And is there like, what what trouble does that cause the business, or what challenges does it cause, and what can be sort of done about it to respect both ends of it?
Well, I think sometimes what people will do sort of when they don't fully understand the space is they'll say, well, like, do we really have to make X accessible because there's only a few people that use it, right? So then you start giving them statistics like, yeah, well, there's, 57 million Americans that have disabilities, and, those people have a lot of money, and it starts to change, or you start to say things like, yeah, Domino's went to the Supreme Court because one person couldn't order a pizza, and it starts to change, the landscape. But I think the initial reaction when you don't have enough disclosure is people go, well, is this really like a big problem? Like, there's not that many people that are being impacted by it, right? And that's on the customer side too, I think. But again, I think all of it compounds. Like, one of the things we're seeing at Fidelity, there's a lot of us at Fidelity that are blind or visually impaired. And now that we're there, and there are enough of us continually going to HR and saying, I can't access this system that you bought, or that system that you bought, or this communication that was sent out isn't accessible. There's more attention because they're hearing about it, not just from one person, but from multiple people. So I think the benefit of disclosure is that there's strength in numbers.
This is Christopher. Oh,
Go ahead,
please.
Go ahead. Sorry.
There's two things I wanted two thoughts that occurred to me. One is disclosure is a difficult thing because people don't feel empowered, or they feel anxious to because they don't, so they don't want to disclose. But what's starting to happen is you're starting to see companies that actually put it on their diversity annual report, the number of people. So now we're starting to hold ourselves accountable. So Google's done this for a couple of years, and Microsoft has done this recently as well. So if you start sharing with the real world the numbers of people that you have with disabilities, it shows that it's considered important enough to share. It's important enough to track and measure, and hopefully that can start changing the context of the language inside a company, because you've brought this up several points. Internal systems, whether it's purchased or internally developed, getting these things accessible is really hard. So procurement processes are a nightmare, especially with large companies where there's no centralized process. So having numbers that you can shoot for and have a number this is what our representation. I think for us it's over 5%, and in some countries we're still not allowed to ask. So I think the number could be higher. But talking about it, saying this is an important part of who we are, moves that conversation forward.
And I think I was just going to add really quickly. I think too, for those that are writing job descriptions, one of the things that made me want to work for Fidelity was the job description that I applied to. There was a bullet in it that said, lived experience with a disability is preferred. And I was like, okay, I have never seen that before. And so again, right, it encouraged right from the top to say, actually, I am one of those people that has a lived experience with a disability, right? Because it was that permission, like to Christopher's point, that permission, that empowerment was there from the beginning. It wasn't like, wow, I should maybe not disclose this because it might actually negatively impact my ability to get this job.
That's interesting. Juanita, you were going to say something.
Sorry, Juanita.
Oh, no worries at all. Really great points. And I'm just thinking back to like our membership, and we serve service members from all branches, and service members actually have a higher proportion than the general population of disability, and a lot of them are service connected disabilities. So you serve your country, and sometimes as a result of that you have a lived experience as being a person with a disability, and that really drives it home for us, because also a lot of our employees are former service members too. And so, that's where ERGs come in, communities where folks, can have a safe place and psychological safety to be able to have those hard conversations and to help the organization grow in a better way. That's what, really helps move the needle forward, I think.
This And that's, I think that that's an important point too, that, depending on the type of business that you have, the impact may be different. It's probably there no matter what, but you may have to, may be prudent to look at your specific business and say, geez, are we really serving our customers the way we should? I think this is a good time to pivot a little bit and talk about the benefits. So every single one of you, obviously, you're in your role because you're bringing accessibility into the organization, whether that be for your customers or internally facing for the employees. What are the benefits that you have seen over time in focusing on digital accessibility in the way that you all do?
For us at Navy Federal, actually, we've been able to reduce the amount of issues that go live by significant percentages by including accessibility in the beginning, in the design and development phases. So when our engineers want to build a new component, we actually have accessibility folks, come into those meetings and we discuss how we're going to build it in an accessible way. And that alone, along with devs just sharing with our accessibility team, their branches, we'll just take a look and verify it. That alone has cuts down almost all of the issues that come out of development. And then that really stops folks from getting into this audit remediation lifecycle, just having that step added.
And I would ask actually for Carlos and Christopher too, and having worked when I worked at Wells Fargo, that's a 240,000 person enterprise. And I know Amazon is even bigger, and I think Google is too. And so I would ask, like, do you think that is harder, right? We do the same thing and we try to do as much of that as we can, but with the amount of volume, right? How do you think that's different?
That's a great question. So the one thing that I believe it works very well at Amazon, specifically speaking, is that all the work that we do and everything that goes around has to be prioritized and thought through what we call leadership principles, right? And one of our leadership principles is customer obsession. So when we think about customer obsession, we don't say customer obsessions for people who don't have disabilities. Right. We just say customer obsessions overall, right? So it has been really beneficial for us to see the benefits of technology and innovation that we do in many different angles, and how people with disabilities benefit from it, and vice versa. When we go and innovate on behalf of our people, of our customers with disabilities, see the benefits that people with no disabilities get from that specific technology, which is something that we call the curbside effect, if you will, right? Going back to the reference of the Americans with Disabilities Act and how the curbside were created, those ramps, and that we all live our lives with taking that for granted, right? So we believe in that. And the other point of view that I have on this is that, as you were mentioning, it could be overwhelming and intimidating when you think about an organization the size of Amazon, for example, is over 1.3 million employees, right? So you can't take accessibility as let's go and fix it all. Mm-hmm. Let's go and boil the ocean, and you need to start thinking strategically about what are the specific areas that our employees get the most impacted by on a daily basis. Let's go and take a look at those closely and see what are the things that we need to put in place in order to progressively but continually and surely improve them over time. Go and talk to those specific owners and bring them support, right? So instead of talking about what needs to be done in terms of accessibility and drop a mandate, like you need to be WCAG 2.1 compliant or any other industry compliant per se, go and have a conversation about what we need to be accomplished, but also what are the tools that are available for them to accomplish that goal. So it's not only about the what, but also the how, and what support do they have within the organization in order to accomplish that.
And I would also
we-
say the who, right? Like,
exactly.
who are you benefiting by doing this? Like that for us has been probably the most powerful tool that we have in terms of scaling, has been really putting faces on this, right? When like, so we have an app that came out called Bloom, and I use Bloom because I use it for my daughter. And the squads that are in charge of Bloom know that, right? And so if I email the Bloom team and say, hey, I found something in your latest release, they're like, okay. And it's fixed within like a sprint or two because they have a person that they associate with the app and that they know uses it, right? So there's like a direct cause and effect for them.
Yeah, this is Christopher. I think there's a huge correlation between an inclusive culture and accessible products.
Yep.
Because for exactly the reason you talk about, in fact, at Google, in the past year or two, we created a dedicated role that we call the accessibility analyst. And these are people who are of the community and highly trained expert, and their job is to not just test, but advocate, co-design, be part of the whole process and make sure that we're trying to walk the walk of inclusion. I wanted to echo pretty much everything that Carlos said. I agree with everything he had, but there's a couple of things I wanted to sort of hang on. He talked about the broad inclusion aspect. There's an organization out here in London called the Helen Hamlin Center, and they're the ones that came up with the term inclusive design like 30 years ago. Well, they have a director named Rama Giraro who has this wonderful expression: if you design for the edges, you get the center for free. Which for me, this is, if you have the MVP, make it a really big MVP, make it a maximally viable product, not just the minimally, because you're gonna get the middle guys anyway.
Oh, that's
People that look
cool.
like me, you're gonna, I get what I need all the time. But if you design for more than me, I actually get a better product out of it because of all the things that I haven't thought about yet in my life. And I'm using myself as an example because I'm a gray-haired male of a certain age. But a couple of things about of the way one would do this kind of work at scale. So at Google, it's a very distributed organization. I would imagine Amazon is as well. We have a central organization that sets the definition of accessibility, but we don't tell people what to do other than it has to be accessible.
Mhm.
The best way I would describe it was we're a hub to spokes. So we in the central team set the definition that takes not just WCAG, but CVAA and OAO and the EAA and all these other organizations and responsibilities that we have to build products. And then our usability context and the pixie dust that makes everything googly and that kind of stuff. And we work with the different teams to make sure that they understand the expectations. We provide training and many other services. But we tell the people that what they need to do and how to hold themselves accountable, and they need to manage it across their organizations. So the search accessibility team works with all the different program teams inside search. Our Maps program team works with all the different people that work inside Maps and associated technologies. And so it's a distributed way, and it's the only way I can really see you doing this at a scale like what we have today. And the last thing, the last thing I say is when you have something like this, it is you want to be pragmatic about how you do this. You have to accept failure and embrace failure and learning and moving forward, because there's no such thing as perfectly accessible. So if you can't be perfect, don't make people try to be perfect. Make things better and better and better. Sorry, Juanita.
Yeah, no, I just had a quick question for you because I actually I think I'm still part of the Google Accessibility Group. And that was an avenue for customer feedback for a lot of years. And I thought that was really innovative, just having a forum for customers to just provide direct feedback on your search engine and such.
So we have what we call trusted testers as well, where we have groups of people that we actually share NDA software, even hardware sometimes, and ask them to provide feedback during the development process. Another important time to get feedback is after you launch, because no matter how good you think you are and how many checkpoints you have, you're going to get it wrong for someone. So we actually have a dedicated free service for people with disabilities on all Google products. So they can reach out to this customer service and get support. And if there's a bug, it gets popped back into the development process, and we work to fix that as soon as we can.
That's great. Mark, also there's something that Vispro provides too, through JAWS that actually allows customers to get feedback too, kind of in a similar way.
Yeah, it's called JAWS Connect, and what it does is it puts in the JAWS screen reader for a person visiting the site, a JAWS user visiting the site. It actually, right in the screen reader itself, it provides a form that the JAWS user can use to give feedback on the site, and it's, you know, it knows where it is. It doesn't collect a ton of information. You know, it collects information about where it is on the site and what version of JAWS and Chrome and all that. And users can be anonymous or not, but yeah, it's a very assistive technology specific. So actually looking at the user and the way that they're interacting and providing, soliciting feedback that way. So fascinating stuff. And I really appreciate, you know, Carlos and Christopher, that perspective on the larger organizations. And Dina, thank you so much for helping me with the panel. Host the panel with some questions. that's good. And you too, Juanita. I think we make a good trio here. And I think that I'm going to declare the official quote of this panel discussion. If you design for the edges, you get the middle for free. That's absolutely fantastic. And I think that, you know, Carlos mentioned the curb cutout effect, which if you're in these circles of accessibility, you hear quite a bit, because it's such a great analogy for, you know, creating a ramp, you know, a ramp in the curves for, you know, wheelchair users, and then all of a sudden people are pushing their strollers up it or dragging their roller bags up it, or just choosing to walk up that curb cutout because it's easier. And I think that everything that you said, Christopher, in that quote about getting the middle for free is it's a really interesting and unique and different perspective on that, on that kind of similar category of concept, I guess is the way to say it. Where I'd like to pivot here now, and as we do this, for those of you who are listening, please, in the Q&A section, we're gonna stop for a minute. I'll make sure we do. So in the Q&A session, a lot of people are making comments in the just the regular chat, which is mostly, I think, Christopher providing us with information, so that's all good. But if you have questions for this group, please put it in the Q&A, and you can start that process now as we kind of round this out with a final thing that I wanted to hear from the panel. And we've talked around this quite a bit, but if you can just sort of wrap it up in maybe a neat little bow for folks, that would be great. What is your advice? Like, I would imagine, if I imagine who showed up to listen to all of you today, it's probably a lot of people who are trying to figure out a lot of what you all have figured out over the years and how to bring it into their business. So what is your advice today for businesses, work groups, anything like that? And when you answer this, please just think about sort of the full spectrum of where somebody might be on their journey, right? Maybe they're approaching their first audit. Maybe they've had a few audits. Maybe they've got leadership support. Maybe they don't have leadership support. You know, we all know that at one point in our infancy, we sort of went through all these different things, and you all and the organizations you work for have really made it. And I know there's a lot longer in everybody's journey, right? Nobody's journey in accessibility is ever over, and everybody will keep innovating. But for folks who maybe are in one of these beginning stages, what's some of the advice that you would give them to help them and encourage them to keep moving forward?
For me, I think one good thing is to remember as a goal is to start thinking about accessibility in your product while it's still a twinkle in your eye. So I think the goal is, the trick is to start. So that the longer you wait to incorporate accessibility, the greater the chance that your product will be inaccessible, or at least expensive and time consuming to retrofit. So when you start immediately, you can iterate, test, learn, and end up with a stronger and more accessible product. Of course, accessibility takes time and teamwork, and there will be growing pains, when what's important is to push for progress and not perfection, I think.
I would back it all the way up to the 100,000 foot view. And I would say, before you can even do that part, which is really important for me, I like to think of like the accessibility team that you're building, especially in a big company, as a business within a business, right? So like when we first, the team at Fidelity is less than 2 years old. And I looked at it when we started it as like a startup. And so as any business does, it needs a mission, it needs values, it needs a strategy, it needs a scope, it needs core functions or core areas of work, right? And those, I feel like those have to be defined as a blueprint before you can move forward, because that's where you create your staffing plan, for example, right? If you are in a technology organization, then, you know, to Michelle's point, you need developers, you need designers, or at least specialists in those with accessibility. If you're in a policy organization, you need people that can do governance, you need people that can do audits. And so I think looking at it as a business and figuring out what that business does is one of the most important parts. So like for us, we are a service business. Our team exists to enable squads because we believe that if we don't give the squads what they need in terms of training, tools, information, right, our customers are never going to get what they need. Because if our squads don't know how to deliver it, then they can't.
To sort of back up even a bit further, leadership approval and buy-in is great, but really getting the buy-in of your colleagues is far more important. And the reason is because the organization isn't made up of leaders. The organization's made up of people. And if you convince just one of those people to join you on your accessibility journey, then you've made another advocate, and eventually leadership has to follow.
And I would disagree with that in a sense that in my experience, especially at a large organization, you will get nothing done without leadership approval, because just as much as it is important for sure to have your colleagues buy in, because they do the ground work, right? If you don't have leadership buy-in, you also don't have money and you don't have visibility. And for us, at least, when I've had senior leaders mention us in a huge organizational all hands, within seconds, we are getting Teams messages from people in that organization saying, my leader just said this was important. Tell me what to do.
I think if I may here, I think I absolutely see Dina's point here, because that's the strategic foundation of how you want to eventually see your new baby from infancy to a full grown adult, right? Going through all those different stages of the growth. And I also believe that there is a lot of a very important message behind what Juanita said of getting your peers around you in terms of in the same page, or like, guys, this is what we would like us to do. Because it's important, and not only is important for people with disabilities, but it's going to make our product better, regardless of your audience. And the other thing that I want to say to those who are starting, and excuse the plane that's coming by my house right now, thank you for doing what you're doing. We need as many of us as possible out there in the world, and even when you believe you're alone, you're not alone. I think that the disabilities community and people with disabilities communities and professionals of accessibilities out there are very willing to share their experiences.
Yeah.
So go out there and search it, and you will find organizations within proximity of you, meetups or of other different natures, conferences happening online that are now free, that have a really good value for what you're intending to do, and that keep the great job. You know, like, it just you are impacting people's lives every day by this very decision that you're making into learning more about accessibility and influence your organization. So that purpose right there, it makes worth the, you know, quote unquote trouble that you might go as you start to, you know, create this startup within your organization that eventually is going to do fantastic things.
Great points. So I promised everybody we would get to questions, so we're going to do that next. And I think that you know, to back up what Carlos was saying, like there's, you know, the point is that it's fantastic that you're trying to do this and do something, right? Like don't get frustrated and stop. If you can't get leadership support today, get the support of your colleagues today. And then when one becomes two and two becomes three and so on, you still do, to Dina's point, need to go get that you know, back to leadership to see if you can get that. It eventually has to come into play for it all to be done successfully. So wherever you are in that phase, keep moving forward, keep doing something. The one option you can't do is nothing. You can't stop. And when you do, everybody talked about backing up, you back all the way back up and you get to start from the beginning. So I wanted to get to some of these questions that are coming through the Q&A right now. The first one this is an anonymous question, and they ask for admins and facility in higher education. What do you believe is most important in accessibility for universities to help future employees? So they're talking about the employees of the university. Any thoughts? I'll read it again while you guys are thinking. For admin and facility in higher education, what do you believe is the most important? What do you believe is most important in accessibility for universities to help future employees?
This is Christopher, and I'm not quite sure what's meant by admin and facilities, so I'm gonna come at this from a slightly perhaps awkward perspective. It's humility and trust that the people of the community know what they need. No central organization can understand all of the needs of everyone, so it's very difficult for you to sort of set up a policy that represents everything that you're going to approve because you don't know what's needed by the people of the community. Not everyone talks about their disability. Not everyone understands that they have a disability, and do people come into the organization? So whether it's a built access, make sure that you have ramps and physically enabled spaces, or whether you have functional tools that help with everything from dyslexia to captions, audio description, make sure PDFs are always put out and accessible. It depends on what's necessary. But to Carlos's point, the most important is that you just get started. But you have to start from a place of humility, saying you don't know what's needed, but you want to listen to the people of the community and provide them the solutions that they're asking for, because they wouldn't ask for anything if it wasn't necessary.
I think that the way you phrase that in terms of humility is really interesting. You know, it's that nothing about us without us concept, where if you want to know how to accommodate for a person with a disability, ask them. And I'll share a quick story where a friend of mine who is the manager in a factory, and they had hired somebody in a wheelchair, and he walked into this person's office after they were hired, and there was all this stuff that the manager didn't understand in there. And he said, well, what's all this stuff in here for? And he said, well, I'm in a wheelchair, so they gave me all these accommodations. And he said, well, what's this for? He goes, I have no idea. Okay, what's this for? I really don't know. How about this over here? I have no idea. And he goes, why is it in here? He said, well, because it's the package that they gave me for a wheelchair. And he goes, well, if you don't need all this stuff, what did you need? He said, I needed enough room underneath my desk to roll my wheelchair. That's what I needed. And that's it. So so I think it's really good points, Christopher. And I think Carlos, I stepped on you jumping in. So please.
Sure. No, I get one of the things that I believe it's important for organizations to think about is it's around the concept of parity and job parity. So are you ready as an organization, university or otherwise, to provide the same inputs and outputs for people with disabilities as they're doing their job? Can you measure the performance of your employees with the same metrics, regardless if they live with a disability or not? And if your answer is not, then think about what are the things that you can do to start allowing that parity, so your employees can be measured the same, and you don't start that having that separation because someone has a disability and you cannot perform or analyze their performance with the same metrics, because at that specific point you start seeing that kind of like separation and not necessarily an inclusive environment any longer.
Yeah, I agree. I think to your kind of piggybacking off of that, it's also one size does not fit all, right? Kind of like what Mark said, like this package of accommodations, right? Similar story, there's always that sort of comparing us to each other, just like they think we all know each other, right? But it's like I was going through a TSA checkpoint and with my guide dog, and they were like, yeah, you need to take the harness off because it's gonna alarm. And I was like, nope, not gonna do that. And they were like, well, this other guy did. And I was like, good for him. but I'm not taking my dog out of her equipment, right? So it's this sort of assumption that if one person says they are willing to do X or they need this other thing, that means every single one of us after that person is going to follow the same procedure.
Excellent point. 5 minutes left and one more question. Alexander Williams is asking, to what extent does a company having an accessibility policy influence digital accessibility? To what extent company having accessibility policy influence digital accessibility? Go ahead, Dina.
Having written one and governed one for like 6 years, I would say there's good and bad to it, right? If you have a policy, then it shows, that there's a regulatory tie because our policy was a risk policy. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the people that need to follow it are going to read it or are going to agree to comply with it. So I think, like, back to Juanita's earlier point, yes, a policy is great. It's a baseline. It shows a commitment on a sort of consistency level. But if you don't have the buy-in of your peers, as she said, to do the right thing, right, then you're not going to. It doesn't really matter. Like, your policy's paper, right? And I think that's something that it distinguishes an organization between one who thinks of accessibility, like Carlos said, as a customer obsession, or a design issue, right? That things are well designed, and the difference between a company that is looking at it from a highly regulatory, risk-based, like, stick approach, right? This is something we have to do, as opposed to something we want to do.
Yeah, this
Something
is Christopher.
to add to that.
One more person. Go ahead, Christopher.
There's just 2 bullet points to this. The policy is as good as the paper it's printed on, unless you have supportive management, which means there are teeth and impact if you don't follow it. If you don't have management support, if you have the consequence of it, it's not really that useful.
Right. If you have no escalation path, then yeah, exactly what you're saying, Christopher. If there's nobody to back you up, then it doesn't really matter.
In what I would say, just to round this out, I think it's sort of the theme circles back around, like, if what you can do today is write a policy, don't worry about the rest of it. Write the policy, because at least you then have taken that tiny little step. Once that policy is in place, now your next step may be, let's get management support. Let's get some teeth behind it, as Christopher said, right? So I think that the way I would answer that question is, the answer almost doesn't matter. If it's something that you can do, if it's something you've got buy-in, if it's a logical next step, go do it. And then once it's done, think about all these things that people said about it, about that'll help you make it not just a piece of paper and be something that has teeth and that people do action on.
But Mark, the other thing you need when you're writing the policy is you need a way to measure compliance with it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to say, like, I don't know, like, release all your stuff without accessibility issues, but then you need a way to prove that.
Yep.
So you need a tool, for example, right, to test, to know that that's happening.
Great point. Great point. All right. Well, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you so much all of you. Thank you for those of you who attended and listened and asked questions. This was an amazing discussion. I have been in this industry for a long time, and I learned and loved the way that you all phrase things and the things that you brought up, and it was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Dina and Juanita, for helping me in my panel host duties. Your honorary panel hosts, and thank the rest of you for everything you do every day and everything you contributed to us today.
Thank you,
You're welcome.
guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for
Bye.
attending. Yep.